Hi, this is Rod Saunders from Jew and Greek. Well, Friday, July 24th, was the first anniversary of my rebuttal of American Gospel, Christ Alone. And so, in commemoration of the first anniversary of that video, I thought I'd offer a few thoughts on the occasion. The video has had nearly 12,000 views at this point, and it's consistently one of my most popular videos. First, many people have commented or emailed me over the past year, expressing their gratitude that somebody had provided them with an alternative viewpoint, because so many were raving about this so-called documentary. Now the truth has come out that the director and 24 of the ministers featured in the film were Calvinists. And although the movie didn't overtly promote the Calvinist view on soteriology, the subtle message was clear, that these men are preserving the true gospel while these charismatics are corrupting it. So let's go over a few comments about my rebuttal. One man said that he didn't hear any Calvinism in the movie. As I pointed out, the hints are subtle, but they're there. You see, if propaganda is done correctly, you don't pick up on the motivation. By its very nature, it has to be sneaky and subtle. Anybody who knows anything about the new Calvinism that has experienced a resurgence in the 21st century knows that they don't come right out and tell you about the doctrines of grace up front. They present the most appealing aspects of their theology up front, and then, after they've lured you in, they start introducing you to what we call the doctrines of grace. It's called Covert Calvinism, and it's a big problem in many churches and seminaries. I'll leave you some links in the description so you can see what I'm referring to. For example, Calvinists talk a lot about the sovereignty of God. Now, what Christian doesn't affirm the sovereignty of God? Nobody's going to be offended when you say that God is sovereign, so naturally that would appeal to somebody who questions the commitment of charismatics who believe that it's God's will to heal. But then, after they take the sovereignty bait, they find out that God is supposedly sovereign over everything, including your salvation. In other words, God predestines who will be saved and who won't. Now, if they balk at that idea, all you have to do is read to them from the Westminster Confession of Faith, like Phil Johnson did in the movie, that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. If that's not enough, they'll take a couple of verses out of context to use as proof text. Romans 9 is a good example. Just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What then shall we say? Is God unjust? Not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Romans 9, 13 through 15. Sounds like predestination, right? But God wasn't talking about some being predestined for heaven while others are predestined for hell. He was saying that he chooses to extend his mercy to some more than others in order to accomplish his purposes. In the case of Jacob and Esau, he chose to make a great nation out of Jacob, who became known as Israel. He's not saying that he chose Jacob for salvation and Esau for condemnation. That view on God's sovereignty flies in the face of the biblical teaching that God loves everybody and desires for all to be saved. But this is what Calvinists teach once you're a part of their world. Covert Calvinism is like pushing drugs. They start you out on the easier stuff and get you hooked, and then they start you on the harder stuff. Or maybe a better example would be Amway. I lived in Orlando, Florida for 7 years, and the founder of Amway owned the Orlando Magic and had a big presence in Orlando, so a lot of people there joined the organization. During my time in Orlando, I had people approach me on 2 different occasions wanting to talk to me about a business opportunity. Well, I was willing to listen, so I set aside a time to meet and discuss it with them. Both times, the person pitching the business opportunity talked for about 15 to 20 minutes about how America is changing the way they do business, and the future is in network marketing. After telling me all about this great opportunity, they finally came clean and told me that it was Amway, which really chapped my hide. If they had just told me that up front, I could have saved us all a lot of time and told them that I wasn't interested. But they know that if they tell you that up front, they'll lose you. So they try to get you all excited about this great opportunity first, so that you'll let down your defenses. If a Calvinist just comes right out with their belief that Jesus didn't die for everybody, limited atonement, most people will stop listening right then and there. If they tell you that God only extends the ability to have saving faith to the elect, and therefore the non-elect can't believe when they hear the gospel because God hasn't given them that ability, most people will reject that. So they avoid those topics and focus on topics that everybody can agree on. God is sovereign, and Jesus died for sinners. Not all sinners, according to Calvinism, but they're hoping that you don't catch on to their phraseology. So when people ask me why I talked so much about Calvinism in my rebuttal video, it's because I caught on to what they were doing. It's very subtle. I would even say that it's devious. But people who know Calvinism know that this is how they operate. And this is nothing new. Let me quote from a book by Dr. Wilbur Fisk in 1835 entitled Calvinistic Controversy, Embracing a Sermon on Predestination and Election. Reprobation is kept out of sight, and yet it is as heartily believed by modern Calvinists as it was by John Calvin himself. It is taught too, but it is taught covertly. And yet, when we quote old-fashioned Calvinism in its primitive plain dress, we are told these are old authors. We do not believe with them. If we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in their errors. And yet, they are witnesses unto themselves that they are the children of them who taught these errors. They recommend their writings. They garnish their sepulchres. They teach their catechisms to the rising generation. They say, even in their church articles of faith, we believe in the doctrines of grace as held and taught by the fathers and reformers in the church. And especially do they hold to that root and foundation of the whole system. God hath from all eternity foreordained whatsoever comes to pass. This was 185 years ago, guys. This is how they've operated for hundreds of years. Reprobation is the belief that Jesus rejected some people before the world began. This isn't the view that most people share about the character of God, so naturally they teach it as covertly as possible. Another comment is that even if the movie is Calvinist propaganda, that's okay because the men they're addressing are heretics. My response to that is, they're only heretics if you define heresy differently from the conventional definition as a violation of essential doctrines. None of the charismatic ministers featured in the movie deny the deity of Christ, the virgin birth, the resurrection, justification by faith, or eternal judgment. Now, T.D. Jakes has a more modalistic view on the Trinity, so maybe you could consider that heresy, but only if you consider the Trinity an essential doctrine, which I don't. Nowhere in the Bible do we read, believe in the Trinity and you'll be saved. In fact, the doctrine of the Trinity wasn't codified until the 4th century in the Nicene Creed. So while many Christians in the first 3 centuries had a Trinitarian view of God, others didn't. While I certainly affirm the Trinity, I don't dismiss non-Trinitarians as unbelievers if they hold to the other essentials. Anyway, T.D. Jakes would be the only exception I would acknowledge, and he wasn't prominently featured in the movie. Certainly, there are controversial teachings in the charismatic movement, just as Calvinism is controversial. But there's a clear line of distinction between controversial and heretical that the movie repeatedly blurred for the sake of justifying their condemnation. This is what I found the most despicable aspect of the film, its attempt to defend the truth through deception. When I first published my video, the movie's director, Brandon Kimber, made a 10-point comment which I responded to. Somebody offered to arrange a debate between me and Brandon, but at the time, I was in no frame of mind to have any dialogue with the guy. But a year has gone by now, and I'm in a better frame of mind. So if he's up to it, I'm up to it. In the meantime, I'd like to ask all of you to share my video rebuttal as often as possible on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, of course. Tell people what you've learned from it, and let them know that they're not getting the whole story until they watch my rebuttal. In time, we'll see more and more people coming around on this issue. Thanks for watching, and be blessed.